Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. We're now going into the day after Christmas in the 17th episode of the JonBenét series, just examining the timeline. In this episode, we're going to go through it step by step, starting from the first officer's arrival on the scene, and then we're going to examine the sort of most obvious things, such as the snow surrounding the house and also the ransom note. Now, what I want to show you in this episode is how one should never assume the obvious is true. That's actually a quote by William Safire. And, True Crime Rocket Science is about seeing the reality. And often the reality is obvious, but it's not necessarily the most obvious thing. And in a staged crime scene, something that is appearing most obvious is hiding something else that's less obvious. Does that make sense? So in this episode, we're going to look at the day after Christmas in 3 dimensions. We're going to look at it through the Ramsey's version of events briefly, as they talk about the opening moments of the scene as they depict it in Death of Innocence. We're going to give the first officer on the scene a chance to give his impressions. And then we're going to look at the crime scene photos, which obviously Detective Lou Smit also relied on heavily. So we're going to look at it in those 3 dimensions. In this episode, we're also really going to restrict ourselves to the morning of the incident. We will probably do the afternoon in tomorrow's episode, and possibly even, we may even need to do this over 3 days, just because there's a heck of a lot to go through. Before we get started, just a big thank you to the many of you who have become patrons on Patreon. Good to have you there. You obviously also have access to the audiobooks, depending on which tier you're on. But good to see quite a lot of you signing up. If you haven't subscribed yet to this channel, please do like, share, leave a comment, and let's get started. So Detective Lou Smit is a really good example of how you can come to a investigation, come to a crime scene, and even if you've got great attention to detail and you've got a lot of experience in a criminal case. So, like the most experienced detective can come to a scenario and be completely flummoxed by it, especially if you start making assumptions or inferences, or you go down the wrong path as your first or second step, if that makes sense. So, in other words, which direction you go into in terms of your thinking right in the beginning governs. It kind of sets the trajectory for all the thinking that follows it. And that is why it's so critical to make those, when you have an obvious assumption, make sure that the obvious assumption that you're assuming is true is true. Now, we're very fortunate that the Ramseys themselves, besides the statements they've given, which I'm not going to go into here, but they give a version of events. It's written down, it's in some detail, of the events that as they perceive them on the day after Christmas. And I'm going to dip into that very briefly. It's on page 10 of their book, The Death of Innocence. And the person who's narrating, so bear in mind the book is authored by John and Patsy, and they sort of take turns narrating, which is quite interesting, narratively speaking, but also just in terms of the situation that we have here, that sometimes the one says something, the one has the sort of authorial voice, and in this case, Patsy has the authorial voice on the morning of December 26th. And not to put too fine a point on it, John's kind of absent. Patsy's sort of she's up and she's active, and John's sort of absent from this part of the narrative. She starts off saying, "I hear John turning on the water," right? That is how the second chapter starts. And again, think about how the ransom note starts. It starts with listen carefully, exclamation mark. And of course, that is written directly under Mr. Ramsey. And if you just think about that for a second, why on earth would you say listen carefully in a note? Because in a note, you're not listening, you're reading, right? It might seem like a silly point, but you tend to say listen carefully when you're talking to someone, when you're saying something over the phone. And that is why some people thought that these comments were actually derived from a movie. I'm not going to deal with that too much, but we will deal with the ransom note. So coming back to Patsy's version here, it starts with, "I hear John turning on the water in his bathroom." And so the events of December 26th, bear in mind, this chapter could start anywhere. It could start at any time. It could start at any room. It could start with anything. But Patsy chooses to start it with herself hearing John washing. So she's not with John, she's somewhere else, and John is washing, right? And she says she realizes it's still dark. And the impression you kind of get is that Patsy was sleeping and she heard John in the bathroom, and that's what woke her up. And I don't know if that's true. I don't know if Patsy slept that night because she was wearing the same clothes that she went to the Whites with. And while I'm someone who can sometimes be a little bit lazy about changing clothes, pageant queen, certainly that's probably got to be one of the big no-nos. Pageant queens must have lots of different outfits, and often they don't want to be seen wearing the same outfit as someone else, right? It's just very difficult to imagine someone like Patsy was so caught up in appearances, letting down her own appearance. And it does seem one of those really, really silly things where if so much attention was taken to do whatever, Patsy forgot to actually change her clothing. Now, there may be another reason for that. It's possible that Patsy intentionally left her clothing on so it would seem as though it was obvious why certain fibers and things were where they were. So there may be method to that madness. It's difficult to say. She says in the next line something about what they always do before departing. They would get dressed before waking the children. Now, I don't know about you, but I would imagine in most families, most households, when you've got to go somewhere early in the morning, you wake the children up first because they're going to probably take longer to get ready than some adults. And so you want to get that show on the road. You want to rouse them. You want to give them instructions. Maybe they must wash or get dressed or whatever. But you want to kind of give yourself a head start, meaning get them going, and preferably get them going while you are preparing as well. The whole idea that you're going to get dressed first and then deal with them doesn't really make sense. Do you agree with that? Then, so anyway, she's talking about they are getting ready and getting dressed, and they're going to leave their children. Now, think about this in the context of what is really going on. JonBenét is deceased at this point. Burke is in his bedroom, and Burke is going to be excluded from a lot of what goes on, right? And so in that sense, it does make sense that John and Patsy are going to get dressed on their own and do what's going on their own. Bear in mind, effectively, their trip to Michigan has just been cancelled. Their Christmas in Michigan with JonBenét's step siblings has just been cancelled. And what is interesting is that John still intended to leave despite everything that had happened. Now, just consider the following scenario. Patsy calls 911. There's a lot to go into in that call. I'm not going to deal with it in this episode. It would just be a really long episode. But Patsy calls 911 just before 6 a.m. and the police arrive. They can't find JonBenét, and there's a ransom note. And can you imagine if John and Patsy did go to Michigan? What would have happened after that? What would have happened to JonBenét's remains? Would they have been taken in the plane? Would they have been left where they were? What do you think? It's just kind of an interesting thing to consider. So Patsy goes on to say, just before we're ready to leave, we'll get the kids up. Now, that does sometimes apply when you are leaving very early and the children might still be asleep, and the idea is that they would travel, that you would travel with them and they would sort of sleep. And so it's like a last minute, you just put them into the car, right? I just can't really imagine that, it wasn't as though they had a scheduled flight. It was more a flight that morning. And it's difficult to imagine, something in the car is one thing, but flying in an aeroplane, you'd imagine you need the children ambulatory, if that makes sense. Then she says, sometimes we even load them in the car in their PJs so they can resume sleeping in the airplane. So that is kind of the spiel that she's sort of portraying. It's basically that they woke up that morning with the idea that they're not going to wake the children up. And kind of what that allows Patsy to do is sort of do certain things without needing to say where JonBenét is or where Burke is. And I think it's more to do with Burke, though, because JonBenét's out of the equation, but Burke kind of would otherwise have been in the equation, right? And there's talk that he was there when Patsy made the 911 call. There's sort of sounds in the background. There's voices in the background. Now, a lot of people don't understand that, like how on earth on a wall phone could that be possible? It's possible because there's another phone in the basement that's not on a wall. And so if you didn't cradle the phone properly in that case, you could have the phone picking up a conversation. So Patsy then goes on to say, take a shower, get dressed, get going, and that's in italics. And that's another thing in their book that I think is quite cleverly done, is the italics represent thoughts, and they kind of put these thoughts that apparently they're having in the reader's mind, which is quite a clever device. Whether it's true or not is another matter, but it is quite a clever device, because the italics are implying certain thoughts which were obviously invisible at the time. So that's the first thing Patsy says, take a shower. So basically the day after Christmas starts off for Patsy and John with them washing. And I don't think I disagree with that. I think they did probably do that. They probably did, at some point, they did clean themselves, as is common in scenarios where crimes have happened. Think about Amanda Knox as one example. Then she says, I swing out of bed and abruptly remember that my shower is broken. So she's deciding to do something, but then she doesn't do it. And then she says, I don't think I need one this morning. I think to myself, just put my clothes on and, of course, my makeup. And so in Patsy's own version here, she doesn't actually take a shower. I don't know if I believe that. I think she may well have taken a shower. If she'd had time, maybe she ran out of time. and then got back into the clothes she was wearing, and maybe the idea was to contaminate the scene purposefully, to be seen contaminating the scene. Now you might think that that's a stretch, but in the Madeleine McCann case, a critical item of evidence was the cuddle cat. The cuddle cat toy that Madeleine had actually had cadaver odor on it, and yet Kate McCann was carrying it everywhere. And one's got to ask, did Kate McCann know something about that cuddle cat that made her realize that was critical evidence, and it was important to contaminate it as much as possible? It's a question. So this is very unusual already, the fact that Patsy doesn't actually, in her version of events, she doesn't take a shower before going on a big trip. Patsy the pageant queen, Patsy the mother of a mini pageant queen. What about the children? Shouldn't the children wash? And so Patsy puts on makeup, but she doesn't wash. And I think that's in a way a metaphor for something isn't cleaned, but something is covered up with makeup. If that makes sense. And then she puts in italics, got to be at the airport at 6:30 or so. The 911 call, I believe, was at around about 5:52, somewhere around there. So I don't know if they were going to make it to the airport within 40 minutes, especially with the children not being ready. So she talks about hurrying down the back stairs from our bedroom to the second floor. And this is something where there's apparently a contradiction. Is Patsy talking about the stairs that she went up and down is contradicted somewhere? I'm not 100% sure if it's between the first statement and the second, but somewhere along the line there's a difference in the versions of events dealing with the stairs. So in this version, she says she hurried down the back stairs from their bedroom to the second floor. Now, there are sort of two staircases from. Bear in mind, this is a house with 3 floors. There are 2 staircases from the second floor to the ground floor, right? One of them is the spiral staircase, which is right by JonBenét's room, and the other one is another staircase connecting the sort of bedrooms of the main house, the parents' bedroom, to an area close to Burke's bedroom. And so she says she hurries down the back stairs and then went to the children's bedrooms. So she would have gone down and been very close to Burke's bedroom when she reached the next floor, but she doesn't go in there. Instead she goes from there towards JonBenét's room, and she stops at the top of the spiral stairs. And where does she go from there? To the laundry area. So just to recap, it starts off with John washing, Patsy wanting to wash, but then not changing her mind, but saying, well, I'm not going to take a shower. And then the next stop is the laundry. You would think the first thing they would do is wake up the children, wouldn't you? If you're about to make a trip and it's going to be quite early that morning. The other thing that's interesting is she doesn't say what time she wakes up. It's not mentioned. She does say that it's dark, and we can determine from that, if that's true, we can look at the time the sun came up that particular day and draw other kind of inferences. Then she says, in italics, need to get a few things together for the trip. So she's in the laundry area, and then she says, not much, we've already got clothes and most necessary items at the house. And then she talks about quickly shoving some of the laundry into a plastic garbage sack that will go on the airplane. Now, I don't know about you. How often have you flown somewhere and your carry-on items are clothing in garbage bags. And the other thing that again you've got to bear in mind is Patsy's someone who's very appearance conscious. Can you imagine her flying, walking to the aeroplane carrying garbage bags filled with clothing? So this part is very, very weird. The fact that clothing on this day of all days has been stuffed into garbage bags. Then she says, so the first thing she does is stuff the clothing into garbage bags, and then she hurries down the spiral staircase. And then this is in italics. What's this? So this is her giving the reader an insight into her mind. There's a ransom note that's just materialized, just sort of been conjured into existence, and Patsy's saying, what's this? And then she turns around and she sees 3 pieces of paper on a step near the bottom. Now she's not very, very clear in saying exactly where it is. Is it on the step, the last step, the second last step? Where exactly is it? And what is also quite interesting is all 3 of these pieces of paper are sort of placed side by side. They're not just sort of placed over one another, but they're placed side by side, and they're not placed like on a table. They're placed just on a stair. And you've got to wonder what that's all about, and we'll deal with that a little bit later when we deal with the ransom note. And very, very early on, this is the bottom of page 10, she says, she bends over and says, must be a note from the cleaning lady. So in other words, she's already implicating the housekeeper here. The very first thing is to implicate Linda. She calls her by name. She says, this must be a note from Linda. And then she goes on to say it's probably reminding her that she needs to borrow money. And so in the very first kind of reference to the crime in a way, it's implicating the housekeeper and also implicating the fact that the housekeeper needs money. And actually Linda Hoffman-Pugh did need money at the time. And then Patsy says, I must leave a check on the kitchen counter. So this is quite from a certain point of view, perhaps quite a lot of pageantry around just finding the note. Oh, it could be the housekeeper, whatever. It's not just, I found the note, I picked it up, I read it. Before she even does that, she's thinking about who could have written it, right? Just think about that again. Patsy finds the note, apparently, right? Patsy discovers the note, and she's puzzled. What's this? What could this be? Who could have written it? What could it be about? Right? It's interesting that Patsy thinks this ahead of the note being sort of read and revealed in terms of the reader's mind. And then she talks about the note. She says, it says Mr. Ramsey. The note is addressed across the top. And then she says she looks more closely. And it says listen carefully. And then she says her eyes fly across the top lines. And then she says she gasps for air. And then her heart pounds. And then she races back up the stairs towards JonBenét's bedroom. And she says the bed is empty. So when she runs upstairs silently. When she runs to the room, she doesn't even call JonBenét's name. So she sees the bed's empty and she immediately knows JonBenét's gone. She doesn't, according to her, go into the room. She says something about she pushes the door open, wide open, and the bed is empty. So in her own version, she doesn't go inside the bedroom. She doesn't check the bathroom. She doesn't look under the covers or anything like that. She doesn't ever call JonBenét's name. She doesn't set foot inside the room. Also, she doesn't turn on the light, and it's supposed to be dark. and we've got no idea whether a light was on in the room, but I guess we can safely assume that it wasn't on, or she would have said so. And so none of this really makes sense in that respect. But in terms of this telling of events, if you're not thinking critically, I guess it can make sense. And then at that point, she calls John's name. She screams. She says, JonBenét's gone. Now, she doesn't know JonBenét's gone. There are quite a few other options. She could be sleeping in another bed. She could be in another bedroom. She could be playing with toys. She's simply gone to JonBenét's bedroom, not found her there, and suddenly she knows JonBenét's gone. And of course she does know JonBenét's gone. Well, in the non-intruder version, if you exclude an intruder from the scenario, then surely Patsy would have known that JonBenét was gone. I mean, and she was gone. We know that now. The question is, did Patsy know that now? And this does suggest she may have, doesn't it? Although there's so much more to dig into in terms of their chapter. I mean, we're already 26 minutes in. I'm not going to go further into Patsy's narrative just yet. I suppose I could continue the analysis later on, but I want to move on to two other issues. Now, the one is the snow, and the other issue is the ransom note. And we're going to deal with the snow through going through Officer French's arrival on the scene. So we've just kind of dealt with Patsy's story about she doesn't exactly say that she woke up, just that she sort of heard John in the bathroom and realized it was dark. It implies that she woke up, doesn't it? So but that is her story of the day after Christmas, how the day starts for her. Okay, now we're going to deal with Officer French's version, the first officer on the scene, and we get Officer Rick French's version of events from his actual statement. I think it's about 3-4 pages. Let's just see, 1, 2, 3.5 pages or so, and we're going to go through it systematically. But that is the end of the preview for the YouTube subscribers. Thanks, guys. Thanks for listening. If you want to follow the rest, you can join Patreon. It's on the $2 tier. I will put a link to this episode in the description. So thank you for listening. So for everyone on Patreon, you can actually read Rick French's